Someone was watching that night and saw the truth no one dared repeat. A man who'd lived alone for 12 years brewed 2 cups of coffee each morning, yet only drank 1. Then he paid $2 silver for a woman no one dared look at, her head covered, her mouth silent, no cry, no plea. That was where the story began. And what followed became the kind of legend the West keeps telling. Each morning before the sun even grazed the eastern pines, Cole Thatcher lit the stove. He didn't rise for anyone, not for duty, not for need, only because he'd grown used to fire existing at dawn. The iron stove groaned like an old bone remembering a break. Wind slid through the cracked window, brushing his patchwork shirt like it was asking, "You still alive, old man?" Cole didn't answer. He hadn't spoken to the wind in a long time. Beside the stove, the kettle settled into a hush as its boil died down. The scent of oats and honey drifted slow across the wooden kitchen, a smell poor, clean, and sorrowful, like a song nobody ever finished. On the pine table, 2 bowls were set, perfectly aligned. One was his, the other placed for someone who used to sit there. Not hope, not prayer. Just a ritual held together by honor. He'd once made a promise, back when that small hand could still cling to his. "I won't let this house go cold." And that promise stayed alive, even if the one who heard it did not. His horse stood tied in the yard, unmoved, as the wind howled through the old barn rafters. That creature, like its owner, made no noise, endured without complaint. By the corn crib, faint paw prints marked the night visit of fox-kits. But Cole didn't set traps anymore. He had no reason left to reclaim anything. Morning passed like a sheet of ash, uncollected, unscattered. He dug into the rocky potato bed, rinsed his hands in cold water, fingers thin as dry twigs. When the sun rose to shoulder height on the cabin, Cole quietly gathered firewood and slung a sack across his back. He needed to ride into town. The rope was frayed, the salt nearly gone, the horse's shoes long overdue. The town lay 3 miles off, down a red dust road bent like an old vein with no heart left to pump it. On horseback, Cole sat upright. No thoughts, no hopes. He rode like a man, keeping faith with no one but himself, just as he still cooked 2 bowls of porridge each morning. At the final bend before the ridge, he paused, looked out toward where the sky hadn't yet dared to change color. The wind ran through the tall pine branches, and for a heartbeat it sounded like the laughter of someone who once sat on the porch and was no longer there. Cole tightened the reins just a little. There was no one there. Only sometimes a man who's lived too long with silence starts to think even the wind remembers. And then he rode on, not in haste, not in waiting, leaving behind 2 bowls on the table, one full, one nearly empty, like a question nobody needed to answer. Burnt Hollow sat like a blot of ink at the bottom edge of the map, where roads seemed too scared to go any farther. The timber buildings leaned with the mountain wind. Signs hung crooked, their paint cracked into thin seams. The general store had its door half open. The saloon was quiet, like even the liquor had up and left. The end-of-month auction gathered on the bare patch of dirt between the chapel and the abandoned jail. A row of wooden tables, a few burlap sacks, 4 or 5 mules. Not much for sale beyond millet grain, bandage rolls, frayed indigo cloth, and a handful of torn contracts. Cole tied his horse to the fence. The animal didn't neigh. It just raised its head toward the sky a little, as if surprised the old man had come back here at all. No one greeted Cole. He didn't expect it. He stopped by the blacksmith first, traded some honeycomb for a handful of horseshoe nails, crossed paths with a young cowboy thumbing through bowie knives. The kid shot Cole a glare, the kind that comes from men too young to understand what loneliness really looks like. At the far end of the market, where voices thinned out, and dust lay thick on the planks, stood a makeshift wooden platform. 3 or 4 men loitered there, faces hard as dry soil, eyes twinkling with a kind of humor that turned cruel quick. On the platform a woman stood motionless, her head covered with a burlap sack, her hands loosely bound with rough cloth. No struggling, no lifted chin. The mayor's voice cracked through the silence like a hammer hitting stone. "Last for today, anonymous debtor. No sponsor, no claim. From Missouri, nobody's seen her face. Nobody knows her name, but she can cook and follow orders. Whoever clears the debt gets a wife, starting bid $2. Laughter rang out, not long, not joyful, just the kind men use to patch over the hollowness inside themselves. One voice shouted, "Could be a witch, or a corpse wrapped up." Another man hooted, "Or just a bag of straw in a dress." No one made an offer. Wind whipped a man's coat open. The girl's skirt hem clung to the dust, torn slightly. Her hands trembled, just barely, like the kind of heartbeat folks don't want to witness. Cole stood 30 paces back. He didn't look hard, didn't ask questions. He just saw a figure that looked like someone who'd been placed in the wrong story, and he understood. Not because he pitied her, not because she looked fragile, but because he knew the feeling of being the last one left when everyone else had already walked away. His hand went up, not with conviction, not with hesitation, just up, like it was the one thing he could do to keep that cabin from being too empty for too long. $2. His voice came out steady, not loud, not soft. The mayor paused, squinting. "Mr. Thatcher, you sure?" Cole didn't answer. He only nodded. A crumpled sheet was handed over. Cole signed it. The nib was cracked. The ink bled, but his handwriting stayed straight. When it came to the woman's turn, the mayor asked, "Name for the record." Beneath the burlap, her voice emerged. Not shaking, not loud, just soft, like frost clinging to glass on a winter morning. "Evelyn." Cole froze, a short breath caught without sound. Evelyn. That name had once been carved into the attic door, where he'd folded the wool blanket one last time. No one noticed his silence. No one saw his fingers tighten around the marriage paper. People began to disperse. The auction was over. No one spoke to him. They just watched, as if they'd just seen something foolish, or something deeply sad. Evelyn followed Cole. Her steps were so light, even the soles of her sandals made no sound. The burlap still covered her head. She asked nothing. Not, "Where are we going?" Not, "Why me?" Cole didn't need her to, because in a world where people were bought with reputation, he chose her for the simplest reason of all. She had yet to be called by her right name. They didn't ride a wagon, didn't speak a word the whole way back. Only the sound of footsteps, one heavy, one light, on damp earth, still holding to the morning dew. The horse led the way, dragging a simple pack saddle with a pouch of salt, a coil of rope, and a lopsided sack of rice. The girl followed Cole, head still covered. Her skirt brushed the ground, gathering red dust and fallen leaves from the woods. Neither asked where the other was going. Neither pressed to stop. The road home wasn't long, but it stayed quiet. It curved along a dry creek bed through a stand of birch trees peeled bare and pines too sparse to whisper anymore. The air wasn't cold, but the wind slipping through reminded them this place was never meant for people who stayed. She stumbled once. Cole turned, not to catch her, just stopped, waited for her to stand, then walked on, as if to say, "I won't pull you forward, but if you can stand, I won't leave you behind." Near the gate, the stray dog under the dead apple tree lifted its head. It didn't bark, just licked its lips, rose, and padded away, giving space as if it too knew someone else was coming home. Cole opened the gate with his shoulder. The wooden latch creaked dry like wind scraping against bone. He didn't invite the girl in, didn't gesture where to sit, just stepped inside, lit the fire, opened a cupboard, and pulled out a chipped porcelain bowl. Evelyn stepped in after, still wearing the sack. She stood near the threshold, hands clasped before her, the posture of someone long ago treated as property. The cabin was small, 2 rooms, 1 fireplace, 1 old wooden table, and a corner where 2 coats still hung, though no one wore them anymore. Firelight flickered up the wall, casting uneven shadows, like 2 memories unsure whether to trust or avoid each other. Cole quietly ladled porridge into a bowl, set it on the table. He didn't say, "Eat," didn't ask, "Are you hungry?" Didn't look at her, but he did scoop a second bowl, set it opposite his. Evelyn moved slowly toward the hearth, didn't touch the table, didn't reach for the food. She just untied the drawstring at her waist, then pulled the burlap sack from her head, slowly, not trying to make it a tragic gesture, just as if she wanted to be seen without being judged. Her hair was damp with sweat, her face smudged from the road. Nothing remarkable, except a gentle scar curving along her jaw. But what made Cole stop wasn't the scar. It was the way she looked around the cabin, the same way his daughter, Evelyn, once looked when she first realized her mother wasn't coming home. A gaze both cautious and grateful, like simply being allowed inside someone's house, was already a gift. Evelyn. Cole repeated the name under his breath, not because she was his child, not because she looked like her, but because that name hadn't been spoken in this house in 9 long years. She didn't sit, just pulled a worn cloth from her bundle, wiped her hands, and quietly added more wood to the fire. The first thing she'd done in this house, without waiting to be told. The fire stirred softly, the porridge still steamed. Cole looked at the second bowl, and for the first time, it didn't feel like excess. The girl, Evelyn, said nothing more, but the stove was warm, and Cole no longer felt like the last soul left behind. Outside, dusk was settling. The forest didn't shriek in the wind the way it usually did. The window misted over. Their shadows sat just a few handspans apart, but neither turned away. She still didn't know how long she would stay, and Cole wasn't sure why he'd brought her here. But the name she gave, Evelyn, was enough to keep 2 people, once abandoned by fate, from looking at each other as strangers. The next morning, Cole woke as usual, not because someone called him, not for anything urgent, just the habit of a man who's lived too long with only his shadow. But this morning, the stove was already lit before his feet touched the floor. The coals glowed deep red. The kettle murmured softly. Evelyn had built the fire early, as if she wanted this house to stop waking up cold the way it used to, when Cole faced mornings alone. She wasn't in the kitchen, no footsteps, no greeting, but near the cracked open window, a damp cloth hung over the chair back, a sign that someone had just wiped dust off the wooden table. Cole rolled up his sleeves and added more wood to the fire. He didn't call for her, just rested a hand lightly on the chipped porcelain bowl, the one he'd set opposite himself for 9 years. This time he washed it more carefully, as if he knew it was about to be used. Outside, the night rain had left shallow footprints beside the doorstep, one faint, one pressed deep, as though the person walking still questioned whether they had the right to stay. Cole went out to the horse pen. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of rotted pine needles, but as he checked the fence, a low growl rumbled from the thicket nearby. A gray wolf, yellow-eyed, fur-bristled, stalked near the chicken coop. Cole didn't hesitate. His hand gripped the hatchet at his hip. He stepped forward slow and steady, eyes locked with the beast's. "Go on," he said, voice low and flat as stone. The wolf backed up, growled once, then bolted into the trees when Cole stamped hard and flung a chunk of wood its way. The fence still stood, but Cole checked every post, tightened every strand of barbed wire. This was the West, where not just men, but wild things tested your right to remain. Evelyn appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a pail of water. She didn't ask about the wolf, but her gaze passed over the repaired fence. And in that quiet glance, she seemed to understand Cole hadn't just been protecting chickens. The day passed in silence. But there were signs, broom strokes on the porch, a window pane wiped with old cloth, a ring of moisture on the table, left by a glass poured but not drunk. Cole began to hear sounds that made no noise, like dry fingers brushing wood or fabric grazing a scar still tender. That evening, Evelyn took her meal to the porch and sat in the old chair near the lantern post. The wind stirred. Her shawl drifted lightly in it. Cole ate inside, didn't call to her, didn't insist, but he opened the window nearest her, letting the firelight spill out. Just enough warmth for someone who wasn't sure she belonged under the roof yet. Near midnight, with the stove embers glowing faint and red, Cole stepped outside. Evelyn had fallen asleep, curled on the floor, no the blanket. Quietly, he laid an old quilt over her shoulders. By morning, the blanket had been neatly folded, placed beside the chipped bowl, next to a slice of untouched cornbread. No note, no words, just a sign she had been there, and took nothing without leaving something behind. In the stove, the ash had cooled and stirred light as breath. The scent of burnt wood, cinnamon bark, and worn wool lingered. The smell of a house that was no longer entirely empty. The homestead sat on the slope of a barren hill, where old cedar crowns shed their needles like silver hairs falling slow. No visitors came, except wind, snow, and night creatures. But that morning the stray dog returned. 4 thin legs, mud caked to its shoulders. Its eyes were quiet, not fierce, like something long used to being turned away, but still tried to come home. It waited, not too close, in the kind of distance no one had to command. Cole saw it from the porch. He was stacking firewood by the chicken coop, while the ground still wore a layer of damp mist. The earth clung to the hem of his boots. The cabin door was left ajar. Evelyn stood inside, quiet as smoke. On the doorstep sat a piece of cornbread, half broken, half whole, wrapped in a clean cloth. The dog stepped forward, sniffed, licked one edge, then ate slowly, as if it once belonged to a home. Cole said nothing. He stood in the yard, watching the moment unfold like a memory. He wasn't sure he had the right to repeat. Evelyn stepped back inside, not shutting the door too tight, leaving just enough light in the cracks for someone still unsure if they could fully cross the threshold. By noon, Cole cooked for 2, not out of manners, but because the house now carried the weight of breath. The chipped porcelain bowl had a spoon placed neatly inside, a sign from someone who maybe wanted to stay. That afternoon, Evelyn came into the yard, holding a broken broom handle, trimmed with a rusted knife. She swept the floor of the horse stall, but when she saw Cole inspecting the fence, she paused. One post had loosened from the night wind, leaning crooked. She quietly gathered dry branches and helped him tie it back with hemp cord. Her hands were clumsy, but firm. When one post cracked, she held it steady as Cole drove the nail. No words passed, only the sound of hammer on wood. A rhythm shared by 2 people who'd lived alone long enough to begin understanding each other. That evening the dog returned, curling beneath the porch beam, eyes shut, ears perked. Evelyn came and stood beside it, without bread this time, just so the animal wouldn't be alone while waiting. The night wind crept through the doorframe. Cole sat by the fire, listening to the soft crackle of burning wood. A sound not meant to be heard in solitude. Evelyn entered, hands smudged with ash, the scent of smoke in her hair. She nodded to him, a small gesture like saying we lived through this day together. That night Cole rose late, parched. On the table, the chipped bowl lay upside down, clean, right where it belonged. The cornbread was half-eaten, split evenly, not crumbled. Outside on the porch, the dog lay beside a torn strip of cloth tied around its injured leg. Evelyn hadn't healed anyone. She'd only placed fabric where it hurt and waited. Just like Cole had been waiting each morning, only now someone else was sitting with him. That night, it didn't rain, but clouds wrapped around the hillside like an old blanket drawn over a solitary roof. The wind wasn't loud, just enough to make the stove door creak and pine branches whisper against the wooden roof. Cole stayed up later than usual. The fireplace still burned low, casting just enough glow to keep the dark from pressing in, enough to make out the shape of a figure sitting near the door, but not enough to see her face. Evelyn sat curled on a stool. The burlap still covered her head. She'd taken it off a few times that day. But come nightfall, it always returned, like a shadow she'd grown used to wearing. No one told her to remove it, because Cole understood. Everyone keeps something close just to survive. He sat near the hearth, hands wrapped around an old tin cup. There was no water in it. It was the cup his daughter used to drink nut milk from. Every time he held it, the ashes in the stove seemed to grow warmer, and the air in the room spoke in a language he no longer needed to remember. A piece of coal cracked. A spark jumped from the fire, flared, then died on the floorboards. Cole picked up the iron poker, stirred the embers without urgency. He tapped the side of the stove, gently, 3 times, evenly spaced. It was a signal he once used for little Evelyn. A soft knock before he entered her room so she'd know. Daddy's still here, nothing to be afraid of. The girl flinched but didn't run, didn't rise. Instead, she lifted her hand to the edge of the burlap, paused, then slowly began to peel it back. No yanking, no drama, just removing it, like someone shedding a second skin after walking too long beneath the sun. Firelight flickered upward. Her cheek was sun-darkened, her skin dust-streaked, and a scar arched from jawline to temple, like someone had tried to carve their name into her face, but lacked the strength to finish. Cole watched, unblinking, but he didn't look away, didn't lower his gaze, didn't stare like a judge. He just kept his eyes there, as if to say, I see you, and I'm still here. Neither spoke. The silence grew thick between them, but not cold, like first snowfall. Not sent to kill the grass, but to soften the dry ground summer left behind. His voice came low, warm, without command or question. I didn't buy a face, and then, after a breath, long enough for the wind to pause against the walls, I just hoped someone would stay. She didn't speak, just pulled the burlap into her lap, folded it once, twice, 3 times, carefully then set it beside the leg of the stool, and nodded. Just once. Softly, Cole rose without another glance. He walked to the stove, added 2 more logs. The fire rose a little higher, casting their shadows on the cabin wall, no longer scattered, no longer out of place. Just 2 figures sitting, with their backs not turned, for the first time since either of them had been called by name. The next morning the burlap was no longer on the table. It lay folded in a wooden drawer, square, clean, like something once needed but no longer kept in the light. On the table, 2 bowls still waited, but today the spoons were set straight, parallel, unshaken. Evelyn said nothing as Cole poured hot water into the kettle. She simply stood there and didn't leave. And for someone who had only ever been chosen to be taken away, staying was the answer. That afternoon the snow melted slow on the roof, dripping steady into a tin bucket set beneath the gutter. That rhythm, tick by tick, lasted all midday, like an old clock counting time not in hours, but by the feeling that someone still remained. In the kitchen the fire wasn't high, but it was warm enough for the heat to stretch across the table's edge, up a wooden bowl, along a sleeve, and into a tangle of hair not yet brushed. Cole ladled porridge into 2 bowls. His hands were still steady, his movements unchanged, even deliberate with the spoons turned just so. But this time when he pulled his chair out and sat down, someone sat across from him. Evelyn didn't ask, didn't seek permission. She simply sat, as if today were the natural continuation of yesterday, needing no explanation, no more burlap, no scarf wrapped around her neck, just her real face, unpainted, and a gaze that no longer looked away. Cole didn't meet her eyes directly, but he didn't turn his head either. The way he sat, his back upright, shoulders unstrained, was how a man sits who's lived alone a long time, but no longer refuses to share a table. The clink of spoon on bowl rang soft, wood against wood, like the beginning of a story not yet ready to be told. She ate slow, small bites, not closed off. Her hand trembled faintly with each spoonful, but she didn't stop. Cole didn't ask if she was hungry, didn't offer small talk, but each time he added porridge to his own bowl, he added to hers. No more, no less. Outside, the wind shifted. The meadowlarks didn't fly in flocks. They perched on the rail fence, wings drawn tight in the slanting light. Like Evelyn, still testing whether this house was built to stay standing. That afternoon, they split chores. No instructions, no conversation. Evelyn folded the blankets from the sun-dried line. Cole shaved down a splintered chair leg. Later, he went out to set a trap for foxes, but didn't set it too deep, because Evelyn once turned her head away at the sound of something crying in the distance. She never said it aloud, but he'd seen it. The way she flinched at pain, not her own. That night, they ate beside the fire. No table, just 2 people, 2 bowls, and the orange wash of flame brushing across their forms, shaped quiet as carved pine. Cole added more wood. The fire climbed, casting long light against the cabin wall, where a wool scarf still hung on a hook, once worn by his wife. Evelyn looked at it for a while. Didn't touch it. Just looked, the way one might look at a hill already crossed, tall, distant, and no longer needing to go back. When Cole washed the bowls, Evelyn picked up the cloth to dry them, not in a rush, not to be helpful, just because her hands were idle and a kitchen, perhaps, wasn't meant to be worked in alone. They moved like 2 people long used to solitude, but who no longer felt they were losing something by having another presence in the firelight. When the flames settled low and night stretched long shadows up the wooden ceiling, Cole took his usual seat by the hearth. And for the first time, the chair beside him wasn't empty. No one called it home, but no one reached for the door. Evelyn folded her coat tighter, arms wrapped loosely around her knees. She still sat, slightly turned, still left a space between them. But in that space, the fire burned steady, and the silence wasn't hollow like it once had been. They didn't need to speak each other's names, because sometimes sitting at the fire with someone on a night that isn't cold is the only promise 2 people once abandoned by the world can ever give each other. Late in the day, the sky bruised purple in the west. The last light wasn't gold anymore, just pale and ashen like spent coals. The forest wind didn't howl. It crawled low to the ground, slipping between the planks, as if searching for things left unsaid. Cole was trimming the horse's hooves, gripping a small iron hammer, his shoulders damp with sweat from digging behind the barn. On the porch, Evelyn spread a freshly washed blanket across the wooden steps. Slow, steady, unhurried. No words were needed. A rhythm had settled between them. Through gestures, through silence, through the kind of gaze that knows when to stop. And then hoofbeats echoed from beyond the hill. Not fast, not frantic, slow, like someone wanted to be heard arriving. Cole froze. Evelyn straightened, one hand holding the blanket's edge. Her eyes turned toward the sound like a creature that's been hunted before. One who doesn't run anymore, but still knows the difference between harmless wind and the kind that carries danger. A man appeared at the tree line. Tall, thin, heavy coat, faded with age. Dust lined his belt. A pistol slung crooked at his hip, but it didn't hide the way he walked without leaving deep tracks. His horse wasn't sweating, which meant he'd stopped before somewhere out of sight and watched. Cole didn't ask his name. He just lifted his chin, barely, enough for his eyes to meet the stranger's jawline. "Sorry to intrude," the man said. His voice was soft, but soft like wet rope. "Seems easy to break, but pull tight and it won't let go. Heard someone around here needed help mending a fence." He smiled, a smile that never touched his eyes. Evelyn stepped back inside, not rushed, but firm. She let go of the blanket's edge, didn't drop it, just let it fall, like she already knew whatever was coming had nothing to do with linens. Cole walked to the gate, one step of wood between him and the man, and a shared understanding that the past doesn't stay buried forever. "Name's Cutter," the man said, glancing toward the porch. "Used to ride with the army. Freelance now, looking for someone." Cole didn't ask who, but the hand holding the hammer clenched a little tighter. "Rumor is," Cutter went on, "a girl with a scar ran from Missouri. Killed a man, on the run, changed her name. They say she's nearby." Wind stirred, not hard, but enough to flap the edge of the newly laid blanket. Evelyn stood behind the door, one hand on the frame. She wasn't breathing hard, but her eyes no longer trembled. "Just making inquiries," said Cutter. "I don't take folks unless I'm sure. Let me see her face. That's all I need." Cole didn't step out, didn't step back. He just spoke, slowly, each word like old wood groaning against old wood. "Ain't nobody here shows their face to someone who wasn't invited." Cutter smiled. "Software. Maybe I'll stop by again when the weather's not so cold." He turned, mounted his horse. No rush, never looked back. His figure slipped into the trees, like the kind of rumor no one knows where it started, but always seems to know exactly where to strike. That night the fire burned longer than usual. Cole said nothing, Evelyn said nothing, but the space between them, once marked by quiet distance, was no longer so clearly drawn. Not because they'd moved closer, but because whatever was coming from outside had forced them to look in the same direction. Evelyn washed the bowls. Her hands didn't shake. Cole dried the spoons and never took his eyes off the door. The wind still blew, but this time the wind was no longer the worst thing waiting outside. The next morning, the sky stayed dim, as if the light itself no longer wished to enter the canyon. Cole rose early, not out of habit, but because he knew this morning's silence wasn't like the ones before. On the table, a cup of coffee sat untouched. The same cup Evelyn used to fill for him each dawn, but this time he poured both cups. One he left behind, the other he carried to the porch. She was there, burlap still covering her head, hands clutching the cloth's edge, not out of fear, but as if even she no longer believed she had the right to take it off. Wind swept through the yard, carrying the scent of distant smoke. Might have been someone burning grass, but Cole no longer trusted coincidences like that. He sat beside her, placed the tin cup down beside her hand. "Someone came last night?" he said, not bothering to ask if she'd heard. Evelyn nodded, slightly. "He'll be back," Cole continued, "soon, and he won't be coming alone." Silence. The wind curled around the doorway. A yellowed newspaper on the stove flipped a page, each whisper like a countdown. "If you want to go." He didn't finish the sentence. She shook her head, didn't speak. But her hand released the burlap's edge, and for the first time she removed it herself. Her face emerged, not flawless, not softened like the fairy tales of princesses fleeing castles, just a real face, bearing a scar that ran across her left cheek as if someone once tried to rip the past from her skin. And failed. Cole didn't flinch, didn't speak. He simply set his cup beside hers, not even 2 hands apart. "That man? He knows your face?" Evelyn nodded. "He has a reason? Or just the power to act?" She didn't answer, but for the first time her eyes lifted and met his. No more denial, no begging, just the look of someone who has nothing left to lose, but still doesn't want others to lose more. Cole stood, went inside, reached behind the stove for the old axe, the one he hadn't touched since last winter. "Guess I'm chopping early today," he said, as if all this preparation was simply for the coming cold. That afternoon, a piece of burlap smoldered behind the barn. Ash rose in soft trails, clinging to the window bars, the same window where Evelyn often sat, watching the light cross the room. Now it cast across her uncovered face, a face no longer hidden, no longer explained. In the distance, the sound of hooves returned, not one, not hurried, but steady, like a promise about to be repeated, this time with witnesses. Evening fell slow, as if the sun itself wanted to linger, to witness whatever was about to unfold. In the yard, the chickens had already been herded back into the coop. The door shut, a timber wedged across it. Cole said nothing. Evelyn didn't ask, but each of his movements, splitting more wood, stacking dry coal into the stove, checking the back door, carried a rhythm no longer rooted in habit. They ate dinner without words, just the soft clink of spoons at the bottom of bowls, and wind nudging lightly at the walls. No one chewed fast. No one got up first. While Evelyn washed the dishes, Cole stepped out onto the porch, an old leather-wrapped revolver in his hand, something he hadn't touched since that winter. The western pines turned to shadow. A raven called out twice, dry and sharp. And then the figures appeared, 3 of them, slow-moving, unhurried. Their horses breathed hard, their eyes glinted like coals that hadn't quite gone cold. Cole didn't move. He leaned back against a porch post, one hand resting on the pistol, not out of intent, but because not preparing was no longer an option. The lead man dismounted, tall, broad shoulders, no uniform, but the leather rig, the hip gun, and the kind of gaze that's seen dried blood on more than a few western doorsteps. "We're not here to start trouble," he said, low-voiced, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. "Just want to know if the woman's here." Cole said nothing. The man stepped closer. "You know the law, don't you? Buying something cheap don't mean it's yours." At that moment, Evelyn opened the back door. She didn't run, didn't hide. She just stood behind the curtain, half her frame lit by oil lamp glow. The light struck her left cheek, where the scar traced all the way to her ear. A scar the man out front almost certainly put there. "You're alive," he muttered. "So the preacher men lied. Didn't burn your body after all." He turned back to Cole. "Listen, I don't want things getting ugly, but if you protect her, tonight's not going to end quiet." No reply came. Cole stepped down one stair, didn't draw, didn't yell like a hero. He just stood, like an old rock wall facing a desert storm. "You get it?" the man said again, voice lower now. "We'll come back, more of us, with warrants, with papers." Cole didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He simply said, "She ain't a thing." And no man gets to give back an old scar to someone who already survived it. The 3 men didn't answer. They climbed back on their horses, didn't draw steel, but their final glance was colder than the mountain wind. Evelyn still stood behind the curtain. She didn't cry, didn't step forward, Just grip the edge of the tablecloth, tight enough to tear the seam. Cole returned inside, locked the door, set the bolt, and placed the pistol on the table, without putting it away. That night, they didn't sleep, just the flicker of oil lamp flame and the soft crackle of embered fire in the stove, like the breath of an old man trying to keep two lives warm, knowing full well there may not be warmth left by morning. The next morning, the sky was the color of worn silver. Clouds pressed against the mountains, making the valley feel like a handful of ash not yet cooled. Evelyn sat at the table, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched, her eyes locked on the place where the gun had rested the night before. Now gone. "I don't want you to die for me," she said, her voice rough. Outside, Cole was tightening a bridle. He didn't answer. The horse had fresh shoes. He laid the saddle, tied a small leather pouch. No gun inside. Just paper, a pencil, and a sprig of pine bound in red thread. "Where are you going?" Evelyn asked. "To see the keeper of the books." "You planning to file for me like land rights?" Cole turned to her. "No one has the right to own a person," he said. "I just want them to know if someone tries to take you, they'll have to walk through me to do it. But if the law comes knocking, I want them to see I chose right." He left before the sun cleared the ridge. Northern winds lashed down, carrying sap and smoke in their breath. Evelyn stood on the porch, fingering a torn thread at the cuff of her sleeve, the same sleeve she'd used to bandage a stranger 3 years ago. Sheriff Miles Harrow, gray hair, a limp in one leg, lived behind the livery. "I'm not here asking for mercy," Cole said. "If they come tonight to drag her out, will you stand in front of them?" Harrow lit a cigarette, studied Cole a long while. 3 years back, a homesteading party wintered on Cold Hill. A man got trampled by his own horse, left for dead in the snow. Come morning, they couldn't find him, only a trail of small footprints and blood smeared on an old coat. He paused. "They say the woman, she ran from slave hunters in Missouri. She was chained in a timber shed, marked with a blade so no one would forget she was property. But she cut the rope, dragged that man out, and vanished. No one knows how she lived through that winter." Cole said nothing. Harrow went on. "If she's that woman, then she ain't property. She's proof that honor doesn't need a name. You bought her for $2, but you never treated her like a thing. The law out west might want to learn something from that." Harrow opened a drawer, took out a document, a fugitive warrant from Missouri, sealed in red wax. The name read, "Unnamed Slave." The description, scar down the left cheek. "This is what they'll bring if they come back," Harrow said. "But I've written to the federal judge, asked to void the order. Can't promise it'll reach in time. But tonight I'll be there with this letter, so they know at least one man still believes in what's right." Cole nodded, turned to go. The wind shifted as he passed the town gate. In his hand, tied to the saddle horn, was the red thread pine sprig Evelyn had left behind, the night she pulled him from the snow. By the time he returned to the cabin, afternoon light had sunk low. Evelyn sat on the porch, an old Bible in one hand, a needle in the other. She was stitching the burlap veil again, not to wear, but to bury. Cole dismounted, nodded, said nothing. Night was coming, and both of them knew it would not be quiet. That night was still, like the first time winter laid its white coat over the mountain pass. No wind, only the sound of crickets under the porch and the occasional pop of firewood in the stove. Evelyn lit the fire for the third time. Her hands trembled, not from cold. Cole sat by the door, a leather-wrapped revolver by his left boot, a hatchet by his right. Out in the yard he had wrapped twine around the fence posts, laid sharpened branches beneath the shrubs. Not to kill, only to slow whatever approached. This was the West, where a man defended what he chose, even if all he had were splinters and rope. "If I step outside, will they shoot me?" Evelyn asked, eyes fixed forward. "They're not afraid of you," Cole said. "They're afraid someone like you survived." The lantern on the porch should have gone dark by now, but then hoofbeats, 6, then 8, slow, measured, like men circling a cabin without needing to shout. Cole took the lantern and stepped into the yard. Its light caught the face of the man who had once sold Evelyn. Thick beard, leather straps hanging from his collar. "I came to take back what isn't yours," the man said. "You bought, but you got no right to keep." Cole answered, "You sold, but you got no right to reclaim." "I've got paper. I've got a person." The man gestured. Another dragged a long cloth bundle. Inside, a wooden beam. "Hand it over, or we light this place up, burn it all down." Inside, Evelyn gripped the hem of her dress. Her eyes stayed open. She opened the drawer, took the burlap she'd once worn on her head, and dropped it into the fire. The cloth burned to ash. She stood. In the yard, the smell of damp tobacco mingled with melting snow. And again, hoofbeats, but not just 8. More, dozens, silent like groundwater slipping through cracked earth. Sheriff Harrow rode out from the tree line, wool cloak, ink stains on one sleeve. Behind him rode 8 more on horseback, 5 on foot. None carried rifles. "I'm not here to arrest," Harrow said. "I'm here to witness. If anyone wants to drag that woman away, they better say plain what they plan to do with her." The lead man spit into the sand. "She's a runaway slave from Missouri, no birth record. I've got a federal warrant." Evelyn stepped into the light. Brown dress, hair unbound. Her voice didn't shake. "I belong to no one. 3 years ago, I cut the chain. I pulled a man from the snow. I lived through fire. I stayed here because I chose to stay." Maya raised a torn piece of paper, Harrow's letter to the judge, sealed in red wax, requesting the warrant be voided. Harrow placed a hand on his sidearm, not drawn, just there. "Anyone touches her," he said, "I'll write his full name in my report, and there'll be someone to read it." Silence, like a night without a moon. Then the horses turned, one by one, their hooves retreating into the dark. Cole picked up the hatchet, never used. He led Evelyn back inside. She didn't cry. Dawn neared. The wind shifted, and the woman who once wore burlap was allowed to stay because someone believed she should. The next morning, fog hovered low in the valley like an old forgotten cloth, thin, colorless, but not cold. The sun had not yet broken through, but the wind lantern hanging from the porch still burned, though the oil inside was nearly gone. No one stepped out to extinguish it. Cole sat on the porch step, his back resting against the wooden post. He didn't speak, didn't smoke, didn't brew coffee the way he usually did. Only the sound of a kettle boiling inside and the smell of cornbread, burnt slightly at the edges. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She hadn't asked a single question since the night before, hadn't mentioned the men, hadn't said thank you. She just stayed. By midday, Cole walked out to the chicken coop. Inside the straw, he found 2 fresh eggs. One was cracked, slightly, but instead of tossing it, he wrapped it in wool and set it on the windowsill, where a sliver of sunlight reached. Not because he believed it would hatch, but because it hadn't proven it wouldn't. Toward evening, Evelyn walked to the well. She lowered the bucket, didn't need direction. The rope tilted, water splashed, soaking the hem of her dress, but she didn't pull her hand back. She drew again, carried the water inside with an old basin marked by a scratch on the rim, a scratch like the trace of someone's nail clinging to something unseen. When Cole returned from the forest's edge, there was a new cloth on the table, a feed sack Evelyn had cut in half and stitched together with black thread. No one spoke of the night before. No one mentioned Sheriff Harrow or the paper he carried. No one spoke the name of the man who had once sold Evelyn, but when the wind crept through the doorframe, it no longer carried the scent of blood or fire, only hay and burnt cornbread. That evening, Evelyn didn't close her door. She didn't say it, but it was clear. This would be the first night she'd sleep without needing something between her and the rest of the world. Cole didn't look in. He simply tapped the doorframe twice, softly the way someone touches memory without waking it. On the table, 2 wooden bowls sat side by side. Both were cracked, but neither had been hidden. A small carrot lay beside them, her share from the basket of vegetables Cole had brought back. The house wasn't bright, but the lantern hadn't gone out. And perhaps, starting tonight, it never would again. Years later, a traveler passed through the town of Bridger's Hollow. There wasn't much to see. Just the same dusty government buildings, a pharmacy that opened 3 days a week, and a saloon that now sold seed packets and rope. But the traveler heard a story, not written in any book, not etched on any stone. It came from a young man with a long scar on his cheek, named Mason, who lived in the old boarding house with a new tin roof and wildflowers growing along the fence line. "There was an old man who used to live here with my mama," Mason said, his eyes drifting toward the hills. "He came when our place was nothing but leaning posts and wind. Nobody knew who he was. He never said." The tale was pieced together from fragments. A quiet auction, a poor man offering exactly $2 silver, a woman who spoke no words, her head covered in burlap. No one quite knew why he did it, but folks say that from that day on, the house near the well had a light burning through the winter. Some say they never married. Others swear they lived like 2 stones side by side, not crowding each other but never drifting apart. And then there were those who claimed the woman had once saved the man's life. Back in a winter, nobody remembered the shape of her face. In the house Mason kept, there was still a scarred wooden table. On it sat 2 wooden cups, cracked but clean. One bore the mark of dry lips. The other did not. Mason never drank from that one, but each morning he filled it to the brim. One late afternoon, as rain lashed sideways across the roof like a whip, someone saw Mason sitting on the porch, beside a native girl holding a baby wrapped in an old quilt. No one asked questions, and Mason didn't speak. Folks just looked up at the porch roof, where the wind lanterns still burned. It's a story folks keep telling about a man who wasn't rich, wasn't famous, but once placed 2 silver coins down without needing to know anyone's name. That story doesn't end. It doesn't need to, because there are some people whose only legacy is that they stayed. And sometimes that's all it takes to become a legend of the West. Nothing more required.